Session on cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. My name's Rebecca Milnes, I'm from the City of Armidale and I'll be your MC this afternoon. But first and foremost, before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all the Aboriginal people present in this room today. Before I go on again, just some quick housekeeping. The bathrooms are through the lesser hall and to the right, and in the unfortunate but probably highly unlikely case of a fire, just go to the exit where you can escape pretty much, and we will meet in the car park. So the reason we're actually holding this session is because many artists, and quite understandably so, are inspired by the strength and beauty of Aboriginal culture and want to actually reference this in their work. And it's really important, and that's why we're here today, to learn about how to make sure this is done respectfully. So 3 presenters behind me here will be sharing their expertise and sharing their knowledge as well about this very topic. And at the end, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. That's why the notepads are there for. If you'd like to jot anything down during the presentations, you're very welcome to, and to ask those questions. For people that are tuning into the live stream, please text your questions through and they will be covered as well. So, today's presenters, I'm very pleased to introduce Ron Kickett, Ron Bradfield Jr. and Matt McVeigh. That's right, isn't it, Matt? Yep. Okay, so this whole session was Rowan's idea in the first place. So he's the driving force behind organising it and inputting into what the session would comprise. So Rowan is a board member of the National Association for Visual Arts. He's a strong Noongar arts advocate and a moderator of the Noongar Art in Noongar Country Facebook page. Ron is a saltwater man from Bardi Country. As the Chief Yarning Officer of Yarns Are Us, Ron is a storyteller who shares true stories on stage and through his arts practice, facilitating cultural conversations. He's worked with artists and art organisations locally, interstate and internationally. And Matt is an artist who explores identities, histories and institutions through his practice and how this can be consumed and subsumed into homogenised narratives. He has been working with Aboriginal communities locally and regionally for the last 12 years. So welcome to all our presenters. Thank you for being here and sharing your perspectives. But before Rowan kicks off with the session, I'd like to invite Mr. Nigel Wilkes to provide us with a welcome to country.
Wanju, you fellas. This is a must. When you have a welcome to country, what happens is you get clarity. So we want you to have clarity. The idea of overstepping that mark, what Rowan is going to talk about a bit later, is very important. And this is a business that we conduct to enlighten you on how we feel about it. So that respect factor comes into play. And also these protocols and everything that you have to do and follow, you'll find out this is very informative. And what you'll find is that you'll hear about identity, you'll hear about stolen stuff, and all that stuff's got stolen from us. And where does it stop? Where does it stop? And you'll find that today with these 3 men. So Kaya Wanju, Nangangara, Nanono, Noongar Maman, Noongar Boja, Whadjuk Noongar Boja, Ngan Jurapan, Ngan Court Morich, Ngan Cart Morich. Nichipalap Gip Jena Colling, Quaba Jena Colling. Mia Jena Colling, Quaba Mia Jena Colling. Kura. Nichipalap Wangai, Quaba Wangai. Quaba Dwonks, Quaba Da. Kura, Quaba Court. Kaya Wanju, Nganonga Maman, Wanju, Whadjuk Noongar Boja, Wanju. What I said then, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. When you conduct business on Noongar country, especially this, with this importance. You need to have that respect. You need to have clarity. So when you do ask a question, ask it respectfully. And with that clarity and that respectful answer, you'll get these blokes the best answer they can. If you do it properly, that's a protocol followed. And that's how we work. We want to make sure everything's clear. Everybody knows what's going on. That's the whole idea. That's the whole reason why we're here. So, fantastic you come along. Enjoy the day. And when you do walk out of here, walk home, you walk safe. Use your eyes to look good. Look where you're going. You don't want no injuries. And welcome to Noongar country and have the clarity. Thank you very much. Good luck, fellas. All the best.
Cool. Thank you, Uncle Nigel, and thank you everyone for coming today, and definitely big thank you to the City of Armidale for making this happen. Cultural appropriation, it's a very sensitive topic, and we have a very long history within our Noongar art. Right from the very beginning, it's been exploited, and you know, we have a lot of people here today who are real champions for our mob and real allies, and we just want to go through, not demonise any artist whatsoever, but this is a chance to explain things from an Aboriginal perspective, build better relationships so we can actually work better together, more ethically and more efficiently in, you know, championing for our mob, particularly within the arts. And where we'd like to start off is just with the definition of cultural appropriation. And it's, you know, the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas, etc. of one people or a society members of another, and typically more dominant people of society. And that's, you know, that's the one part where it says, you know, the typically more dominant people in society appropriating a minority, and that's pretty much what we're talking about today. It's also comes to financial rewards in appropriation, and also social gain is a big one, and that's one probably what we'll be talking a little bit more about today, is the social gain, because financial reward is one thing, and that's been happening for many years, and we kind of, you know, we know about all the fake art that's been heavily promoted, but where is the grey area where it comes to social gain, and where is the line that we go from that? So conceptual versus stylistic appropriation. Conceptual is generally the ideology behind the piece, versus the actual stylistic portion of an art piece. And we see lots of, you know, within the fake art, that's stylistic appropriation. What's conceptual appropriation? It's the ideology behind the piece, and what concepts are you talking about as an artist? And that's something that Matt's had a bit of experience in. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Matt?
Probably. Is this on? Yep. About 5 years ago, I was a co-lead artist for an exhibition called Australianiality, and it was looking at us as all Australians talking about shared history. And a lot of my work was about histories like the Pilbara Strike, Rottnest being a black prison, things like that. And I made such a volume of work that it sort of appeared on Instagram that I was an Indigenous artist. I'd always put up, I made a work where I smashed Captain Cook's bust, talking about, you know, that I'm kind of pushing back against that history. And Indigenous artists saw the work and realised I was a white guy, and sort of made me realise that maybe what I was doing was actually co-opting black stories or telling black histories, even though I've got different politics to back then, because it was about 5 years ago, but I do feel there is a space for shared history, but it's a very murky space, and I suppose being someone who was in the audience, I thought I'd come along because I would have personally benefited from a talk like this 5 years ago. Yeah.
All good, Ron? So what is cultural appreciation? I started looking up the definitions in dictionaries and trying to figure out what the academic definitions are, and I found this really quite interesting. This is what I found in the Australian dictionary. Sorry, we could not find cultural appreciation in the dictionary. And I thought, from an Aboriginal perspective, that's quite fitting for the country we live in today, and from the experiences that we have and Ron would know all about that. But I thought that was a really good example right there that our academic field don't actually have a definition for cultural appreciation, and that was quite telling to me. I found this really good article from America, and she kind of explained it beautifully, where it says the appreciation is when someone seeks to understand and learn about another culture in an effort to broaden their perspective and connect with others cross-culturally. Appropriation, on the other hand, is simply taking one aspect of culture that is not your own and using it for your own personal interest. I thought that was a beautiful example of a definition of what cultural appreciation is. Any comments on that? When does appreciation become appropriation? And again, there was an American historian, George Lipsitz. His writings in 1990 argued that cultural appreciation becomes cultural appropriation when an element of culture is adopted for a marginalised group without respect for its culture, meaning or significance, or with the purpose of exploiting the culture for economic or social gain. And as that social gain term again, what do they mean by social gain? Which we'll touch on that a bit more in a minute. Virtue signalling. That comes, again, it's an expression of an opinion, either favourable or unfavourable, which is intended to indicate to others that the person uttering it holds views in line with what is considered to be correct, thus promoting their social standing. So when you look at virtue signalling and appropriation, they both mention that social standing, that social gain. I think we've spoken a bit about this, Matt, particularly around, the Black Lives Matter parades, the Invasion Day parades. A lot of people go down there for their photo op and then they go home. But when we look at that, in a sense, it's a crowd. We need numbers to make that work. Otherwise, numbers, if nobody turns up to that protest, what's the point? So when we look at an individual setting, if that person continues protesting on their own without any Aboriginal people or support, what is a one-person protest? What are they actually achieving with that? The only person benefiting from that one-person protest is that one person, because all the limelight gets put on them and their profile. Anything you want to add to that, Matt? Ron? I don't want to do all the talking. I'm behaving. A little backstory. This is a piece I wrote, and it's called Not So Kind Regards. And I had a piece in a art award, and I had a young Noongar artist send me a photo of my piece, and she said, it's so good to see an Aboriginal art piece in this award that's actually done by an Aboriginal artist. And that kind of made me look a lot deeper into this subject, and I'm thinking, what is she talking about? So I looked at the actual art award, the online exhibition, and I found the pieces she was talking about, and they were, Aboriginal concepts, using our language, using our culture, and it wasn't necessarily a stylistic format, it was that conceptual thing that they've taken. And I'll just read this out. It says, "Dear non-Aboriginal artists, if you feel compelled to create statement artworks regarding issues that Aboriginal people face, please remember we do not need you to speak for us. We have our own voice, which is the only voice that should be heard when speaking on issues that affect us. We have our own artists who have a voice, which you have just taken an opportunity from. Can we please stop rewarding artists who are making statements that are not theirs to make? You need not speak, but only listen. Not so kind regards, angry Noongar artist, Rowan Kickett." So that was something, I was very frustrated after this exhibition seeing these pieces, and if I didn't create something, I would have exploded like most artists, so I ended up writing this and penned it as an open letter. And I think we've spoken about art awards and what space are artists who are, creating these types of work taking? Are they taking an opportunity away from Aboriginal artists? Are they, is that space? There's not too many Noongar artists who are creating artworks in this area, but does that mean that non-Aboriginal people can take up that space? And we spoke about that a bit earlier, didn't we, Matt Woods?
Yeah, there's a lot of artists over east that are sort of making more adopting Western art practices into their work and appropriating Western culture to talk about histories. Over here, there's less. There's more artists working working from the idea of country in their work rather than histories, and that motivated me to make this exhibition about shared history, because there wasn't a lot of people working in this space. But as Rowan's made me aware that that's not necessarily the right way to come at it. Yeah.
I think too, though, you forget some of the context of how you brought together Australia. I can't even recall that off the top of my head now, Matt, don't hurt my brain like that. But when you first started that, you actually did invite Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal artists to work together, right? And that was actually more of the starting point for that conversation. It just changed as it grew, right? Because people struggled with the nature of what it was that they could represent together and what they could put on the table, not just from a cultural concept point of view, but more just it's a fairly new thing within the last 10 years. We start actually having a conversation safely together about where it is we live and put our feet down in this country. And it's also become a fairly trendy thing, for want of me being cheeky to say that. And that's where a line is a real struggle for us, isn't it?
Yeah, and just as I said, I've had a lot of support actually from Aboriginal people about my practice. So I've had two people inside the fence. Like, I've had more support than people demoning what I've done or what I've tried to do. And I've been working in this area for years, but it's also a very small part of my practice. And it was quite fascinating that when I started making work, looking at Rottnest and the Pilbara strikes and legislation that had affected Indigenous people having human rights in this country, I was wanting to educate someone younger than myself who was white. I was talking to a white audience. I never said that I was Indigenous, but it is such a murky area, and that's what I'm interested in talking to about, that idea of actually expressing the shared histories, but also where it becomes taking voice away from black people. And if you do make a lot of work and you're putting it into exhibitions, you might be taking that opportunity from a young Noongar artist on this country making that type of work. So,
yeah, and I think too, Noongar artists who are coming up, the next generation, if they come up and they want to explore this stuff, is it fair to them that it's already been explored by a white person? And then is the attitude going to be, well, we've already had that work, we don't really need to see it from you? And there is a very discriminative mentality within the arts where this artwork will get chosen over an Aboriginal person's artwork. And it's like, they want our culture, they want our stories, just not necessarily from us. And that's what it feels like as an Aboriginal artist within the arts in Perth. Yeah. All good? Cultural permissions, this is a big one. And a lot of people will go to an elder to ask for cultural permission to create artworks on cultural stories or our history, and they essentially buy it. It's almost some elders sell their culture to these artists, and a lot of the questions that I've raised around that is, do our elders actually have the authority to give our culture away to non-Aboriginal people to create from? And there were discussions that I had, because I've seen a few public art projects where there was a Six Seasons big, huge public work piece that was created by a white artist, and they had an Aboriginal cultural advisor on it. Any comments from Sophie?
I think most of you, certainly those of you who have worked with me through ArtSource, have had many conversations probably in and around this, the nature of how some teams pull together a body of certain people who have particular creative expertise, and then we'll pull somebody in to have cultural expertise in order to feed a design that might actually pop into the public art realm. I'm probably the least qualified in many regards, because I too am not of this place. This is Wajak Noongar Budja. And I'm a Bardi Amba. I'm a Bardi man who lives here by the grace of those who actually let me sit in and amongst their business on this country. And so I constantly have to walk a fine line culturally in the nature of how it is that I actually help good conversations happen. So those of you who've actually, I've had many artists come and seek cultural permission from me for things, and I end up just guiding them gently to the point where actually you're talking to the wrong bloke. What you actually need to do is have decent conversations with people who are of that place and hold those stories, if that's something you possibly can do. And if you can't do it, then one of the obvious things is not to. I mean, there are certain stories and permissions just from where I come from as a Bardi man, that the people who had the permissions to, I guess, in order to be able to allow for those conversations to occur properly, the way they would perhaps within our cultural circles, those old people are gone now. So those stories can't actually be held in a good and authoritative way in relation to that particular business in that space. But the sorts of things perhaps maybe we can open up for conversations is the stuff that's open to public. You know, it's already open to public and it's not private or sacred business. And the finding out of that always comes back to those that are the keepers of that sort of business in this country, you know. And the nature of what permissions might look like, well, that might actually be a bigger conversation, because I don't think necessarily it's as simple as one person has permission to say, oh yeah, you can do that there. Because if that was the case, gee, I'd be in trouble at home, just trying to put stuff away in the kitchen. It's a fraught place to play in. The nature to want to try and be culturally respectful to a T, to try and represent things accurately, might not necessarily be something that you have the right to do. But you might touch it and work around it in an abstracted way that actually seeks guidance from those who can guide that culturally and appropriately. And I think that's probably more the point.
And you've had some experiences up north with different mobs. Can you talk about how different it is working with up north mobs compared to Noongars?
Yeah, it's like, you know, for example, when we did Australianiality, I had worked on Yawuru country, and when I heard this word lian, which I'm not going to try and explain what that word means in an English concept, but I mean, it's sort of a very spiritual word about that sort of, I suppose we talk about soul, spirit. Maybe you can explain the word lian.
Well, lian is a Kimberley concept, and I won't necessarily explain that here, but it's well-being and being in the centre of yourself, okay, and feeling good here. So for Noongar people, it's a whole other way it's represented and spoken about.
And so the premise behind it conceptually was to sort of dual name, so Australian, or to be Australian, or to have Australian or reality, like a transition of moving towards a sort of healing state of us. We had to be truthful. So I got permission from the Yawuru mob to use the word, and we only used it in the context of that exhibition. That was fine. They were really happy to be a part of that. But when we put the word to the Noongar community, they were upset because it wasn't their word. And a few Aboriginal or Noongar people said, why don't you use the word Wirran? And it was Wirran's another slightly different concept again. So I had permission from one group and then not permission on the other group, but we brought the two groups together, and a decision was made that the word could be used. But that was sort of something that I think a lot of people don't understand, like the language is so diverse and ideas change and shift from different cultures. I suppose what my analogy was like, I had Russians telling me how to use French. It's a completely different language, different concept, and so that was the complication.
And I think with permissions, when you're talking about different communities, the up north, mobs up north, what affects them is completely different to what affects us down here. So if you could get permission to do something with a community up north, but you come down here and it might be completely unacceptable. So you need to build those relationships with every community that you want to work with and have a real strong relationship built. On this topic, we have a Facebook page called Noongar Art and Country, and I thought I'd put up a poll just to see from my own community around, do our elders actually have this permission? And This was the outcome. I put up a question: do our cultural advisors or elders have the authority to give permission to non-Aboriginal artists to create artworks from our cultural stories on Aboriginal art projects, or should these opportunities only be for Noongar artists? And you can see there, out of 90 people, 85 of them said no, it should only be for Noongar artists, and only 5 said yes. So that's pretty clear from what our community expects from our elders and from these permissions. If you do need to get permission on anything, it should really end up becoming a collaboration, realistically. Language, we kind of touched on that a little bit. But when we see Aboriginal artworks using Noongar language, immediately you think it was an Aboriginal artist, because that's the language that's been used. And as a Noongar artist myself, when I use language, it's because that's the language that's for the cultural language that I'm using and representing on the canvas. But I'll always put in English in brackets the term next to it, what it means. And I spoke with a lot of people in our community around on this topic, and they said that why can't non-Aboriginal people do that? Why can't they use our language, but our language be in brackets and then the actual title be in English? So they're showing respect for our language, but they're not actually using it as if it's theirs. And it stops, any confusion as to whether this artist is Aboriginal or not, because it's an English word used. And I've seen that quite a lot, where people think straight away, oh, who's this Aboriginal artist, just because it's titled with a Noongar term. And Matt's used quite a bit of language in some of your paintings.
I've only, not a lot, I've done 2 works. I did a work called Wudgem Up, where I kind of went over the word rottenness to put Wudgem Up. And that was me trying to be respectful, because that's the name of the place before it was colonised. But the work I titled Wudgem Up, and after hearing Rowan say maybe call it rottenness bracket Wudgem Up, I'm happy to do that, because my intention wasn't to present a work that people would think was Aboriginal. I personally wouldn't make work with Aboriginal names in a competition or an exhibition where I don't have control about who the audience are, knowing that I'm white. I think that's a very good point too. And like I've worked for Yirra for the last 10 years as their designer, and they've taught me how to speak certain Noongar words, because I have to work with scripts and translate that into design. And I taught Noongar with some of my mates, Quitter. So from that community, they've been very forthcoming. They've actually encouraged me to use Noongar language. And when I made these 2 works that I'm talking about, I got permission from a Noongar linguist to use Wudgem Up, and there was an acknowledgement of country she gave me for a work about frontier wars. And since meeting Rowan, he said, maybe it's a different context, because you're working in visual arts and how it's presented, you don't have that control. Whereas when I'm working in theatre, in scripts and stuff, it's sort of it's got its own context around it. So I suppose my politics have changed around white fellas using language. I think it can be done respectfully. I don't think it's an area that we should gatekeep and shut down, but we need to have the right protocols around it.
I think probably one of the things that probably make this just that little bit easier is don't try and turn yourself inside out about it. Okay, there's far too much of this trying to get it accurate from one point to the other. We have a whole nation that refers to us as Indigenous people and makes us this generic smudge, basically, underneath Australian society. We're not a generic people. We are all of our own nations. To give you an example of what I'm trying to talk about here, I was working with some students from John Curtin High School or College of the Arts 2 or 3 days ago, and they were talking about Wudgem Up. They wanted to do a little story about Wudgem Up, and the young lass that started the conversation off with me said, "Oh, we've been told that Wudgem Up is the Indigenous name for Rottnest Island." And I pretty much just stopped her there. I said, "No, it's not the Indigenous name for Rottnest Island. It's the Noongar name for Rottnest Island. Do you know where you are?" And we had a conversation about where it was to be able to say that from where it was that it comes from, its root place. It's not a generic term, okay? If in this society, the generic term for that island is Rottnest. That's what it is. If you're working with people that actually know it as Wajimuk, then you might have that conversation. Those of us who have ancestors on the island will call it Wajimuk, because that's where our old people are. We'll pay those respects because we're on this land, on Wajak Nunga Buja, where people have that conversation from that. But there isn't necessarily always a need to qualify these things. I think perhaps the best thing when you're talking about using language respectfully and deciding to represent a point of view is decide on your point of view first. Okay? You have your own stories. You put your feet on this country and stand as you stand, given your background and your cultural odds and sods and where it is you come from. So your own personal perspective is of that first, as many of the layers are on this land. Now this country, this Buja, knows thousands and thousands of layers of culture on it, of the people that are just here previously beforehand, let alone the rest who came after. So thinking about who you are and where you stand when you start to talk about these sorts of things probably matters first. Buying into the whole, what the federal government will call us, and then what the state government calls us, and then what local government calls us. Local governments are actually getting much, much better at bedding into the nature of the land in which they stand. And they have conversations driven by local community and cultural groups. Sometimes, if they're actually doing smarter business, they've got elders that help them have these conversations. You can go back to local governments for that, in some cases. But certainly, if we already have a town that's rooted, its name is rooted in Noongar language, and it's called that, then that's what you'll refer to. Don't turn yourself inside out about it. But if it's called Bustleton, and later on you learn it has another name, it is Bustleton to you, perhaps. You can now be aware that it actually has this name, and you can find out about that. And you can tell your children about that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what you have to do is root your work, artwork, or whatever you develop in that. Be true to who you are when you stand in your stories on this land, and respect ours whilst you're at it. I think that's more what we're talking about.
Yeah, and talking about complexities of our culture, there's no cookie cutter approach, and a lot of people try to, correct families. Oh, that's not how the story goes. But that's how my family story goes. And what people don't fully understand is, particularly in the Noongar country, there's 14 different language groups and different people. And within that 14 different groups, there's different family subcultures. So there's, even within one group, the culture's not exactly the same right through, because each family story might vary differently to others. So when I get people telling me, oh, that's not how you spell this, or that's not how that story goes, because that's what I read on the South West Land Sea Council, it's that cookie cutter approach, and I get corrected all the time because I don't know who I am or my culture, because someone keeps read it on a website and they know me apparently. So it can be quite frustrating, and particularly with language. There's, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 different ways of spelling Noongar. And, people keep continuously correct. Oh, that's not how you spell it. Oh, that's not how you spell it. Oh, well, okay.
You'd be surprised how many times we get told how to spell our own language. Not bad for a spoken word language, is it? Like, okay, well, thank you for that.
This next diagram, quick shout out to Andy. He's the one who designed this for me. And it's just a good diagram of understanding that shared history of, we have Aboriginal history, white Australian history, Aboriginal perspective, non-Aboriginal perspective, and right in the middle is that shared history. Now, talking with Matt and building a relationship with Matt, I've come to realise that we have a shared history, and non-Aboriginal people have the right to explore this and interrogate it within their own perspective and on their own terms to understand who they are as a person, because it is really important to Australian identity. And most of the time that history is not written, it's not shared, and by exploring that you can really get a sense of identity as an Australian. And you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, the work that I made for Australianiality was all about that was my approach to try and talk about shared history and things make work for a younger self, like someone at school that hadn't been educated. I mean, this curriculum's got a lot better, and I mean, I don't even know if we'll be having these conversations in 15, 20 years, because I think ownership will have taken its place with Aboriginal people telling their histories. I think we'll know these stories, and I don't think artists will be making as much work in this area. But it is a contentious space because it has become a trend. I've noticed there's a lot of artists that talk about colonialism. There's like three, colonialism, climate change, or personal identities around sexuality or colour or race or any of those topics. And there has been a trend for non-Aboriginal artists to talk about black histories. And I suppose that's why I came to the talk, because I'm more interested in that sort of space where it goes too far and you start telling someone else's story.
Within this, a great example is if you're going out onto a protest with Aboriginal people and it's all about Aboriginal history, Aboriginal issues, and it sits right in that Aboriginal history circle, and you're making a banner with a statement about that topic, that's exactly what, and walking side by side with Aboriginal people, that's exactly what we want. But if you take that banner on that history, on that topic, and then go and exhibit it on your own in a gallery, that's now appropriation, because you're no longer walking side by side. You've just stepped in front, and now you're flying solo, basically, on a topic that isn't yours to talk about, really. And that's, one way to understand it is that concept. A lot of allies and all that, they want to continue the fight for us, and that's the problem. They're continuing it for us, not with us. And that's where, this concept is really coming from, is it your perspective? Is it your story? Again, what Ron said, is it coming from you as a person, as an individual, and as an artist? And down the bottom with the two arrows, what perspective are you actually coming from? And that's a very important point, where sometimes the actual artwork itself might sit in the Aboriginal history, but the concept might be white Australian history, and vice versa. The concept might be Aboriginal history, but the artwork might be white Australian history. And to me, looking at artworks like that, I get really confused. I'm like, what is this artist even trying to do here? It doesn't make sense to me as a person seeing artworks like this, but when they're married up in the right place, coming from the right perspective, that's when the work is at its strongest, I find.
It's also important to realise too that, pardon the pun, it's not quite that black and white. I have people who actually come to me and say, but you're a perfect example of this, Ron. You're exactly that in the middle. You have an Aboriginal mother and a Ngaria father, a white father, who's actually of Irish descent. You're a walking version of that. You sit right in the middle of that Venn diagram and you fill that space. In a simple way of representing that, sure, that's fine. Look at me immediately right now as we are here, and you can see me there. But what you don't see behind me, if you just take that as your measure, is what's shaped that historically in this society. All right? All of the depth behind me, really, and I'm a son of a stolen generation woman, is actually buried in the trauma and damage done by men who have taken black women. So trying to say it's that simple, that's not the truth of it. Okay? And trying to say it in this country, in Noongar country, is even worse, because you actually sit in the most deeply affected part of Western Australia that's been impacted upon by people coming and taking of these people before they got to my mob up in the Kimberleys. So the complexity of this is we are still a nation that struggles with the truth of the trauma that's occurred upon it. And if you simply just sit there and say, well, but, we're all mixed up now. Surely we can talk about it like that. It's just not that simple. It's an extremely complex and sensitive subject. So the presenting of perspectives and the right for Noongar people especially, because this is where we are, to present their perspective from their truth is theirs. And should you wish to work with them on that, then that becomes a collaboration. And the person who guides you in that are the Noongar people.
And I think this shared history part, like I said, that can be very, very muddied. The line isn't, it's a broken line because there's no real distinct line. And that's where we have to make best judgment of who you are as a person. And
it's still raw.
Yeah, and what side are you entering that shared history from when you're creating works on this? And Matt's been kind enough to actually use some of his artworks as an example. It's not easy to show your artwork full stop, but to have it critiqued in this type of forum, that's really quite courageous. So this is a work from Matt, and I'll let him talk you through it.
So I made this work probably 5 years ago now, within the context of exhibition, looking at shared history, or like histories that were not known to people like myself from schools. So this was a propaganda or a travelling poster for Rottnest, which was Rottnest for the Glorious Holidays, and so over the top of it in whiteout, because I used all these whiteout correction pens because they were correcting like archival materials at the time in government using whiteout, and so when even using the whiteout, like I had to stipple the whiteout to get it out, so there's dots which become problematic because the dots aren't necessarily the aesthetic of Aboriginal art, like painted with a brush and like going around sacred imagery, but it's a murky area. So I put Wadjum up over Rottnest because it's talking about its dual naming, and then over the Isle of Girls nestling in the Opal Sea I wrote Black Prison, and this is where I reckon the work goes too far, is where it says Warraminditch, which sort of our place of sickness or place of sickness, which was what the Noongar people that I consulted making the work called Rottnest. So when I said to them, can I put that in the work? And they didn't have a problem. But when you present this work without people not knowing that you consulted with the Wadjum up and like our place of sickness, it looks like I'm speaking for them, which only when I sort of showed Rowan the work I've realised. So I'm re-exhibiting these works and I'm going to correct them. For example, the first correction is going to be called, the work's going to be called Rottnest with brackets Wadjum up rather than just the statement Wadjum up. Over the work, there's maps. There's the maps from Fremantle to the quad in Rottnest, and then there's obviously Aboriginal men that are sort of being buried and getting pulled along by chains. So I've decided to draw this rather than use archival material because there's sensitivity about showing Aboriginal people that have passed away for certain some members of the family can't see. That's a protocol, so that's why I decided to illustrate it. But it was me, I suppose, in the kind of decolonising this very whitewashed idea of Rottnest. I think the work successfully discusses that, but it does go too far. If you didn't know that, if I wasn't here talking about it now, you saw that in a gallery, I do think people would make the assumption that it was made by a Noongar artist in hindsight. So that's why I put the work out here to be critiqued. I mean, maybe you two can talk about it, and other artists that make work about, there have been artists that have been white that have made work about Wadjum up.
There's been a few artists who have made reference to Wadjum up. I mean, I actually have supported a few artists in how they've explored Wadjum up and discussed it from their point of view. But the key is that what I was trying to actually help them do was to find a way to speak about it that was rooted in their stories, yeah? And not necessarily try and tell anyone else's. And again, I keep coming back to that point. If you're trying to actually, and maybe that's just me as a storyteller, if you're trying to be too literal in the nature of what it is that you create and present, and then suddenly this tips over and you run the risk of looking like the expert talking for it, instead of remembering who you are as the creative, questioning it or critiquing something perhaps, or even just having commentary on it, it's really easy to step over that line. So being sure about how you want to approach something, having good conversations before about how you do that. And Tanya Ferrier was Tanya Ferrier, my brain's gone blank now. Particular artists, the artists that I've helped have actually sat with me and had long conversations about how it is that they've wanted to actually look at something, and they've bounced stuff off me on the sounding boards. And once we've actually helped them clear their perspective up, I've then gone, right, I think now you need to go and talk to this person or that person to get the proper cultural, guidance in this. And Jade, sorry for pointing you out, but your granddad was one of those people that helped make that sort of conversation happen. We would actually have big yarns about how something might be spoken about first, bring it right down to the essence of it or the point of it, and then go and test it against somebody who actually could speak about it from a cultural point of view that was appropriate. And that wasn't me. So I would actually recommend around me cultural representatives that actually take that on. Because that's the way we have good conversations about things, good and proper conversations. And as soon as somebody actually goes, no, I think you're going too far, or no, I wouldn't talk about that. Okay, I need to step back. I need to take my ego out of this and step back and reconsider what it is I think I'm trying to present. Because we do get trapped in our ego in this. And that's not something that should be driving you when you're making works that represent other things. And I say that as a male who, by sure, has been told up enough times when I actually have overstepped my mark speaking on things that don't concern me as a man.
This next image is on massacre sites in the frontier wars. And I think this piece sits right in that muddy water visually. But the actual title and the perspective definitely comes from that White Australia history. And you want to talk through this piece, Matt?
Yeah, it's a found lithograph of a white artist from New South Wales that did an etching for the newspapers back around when this was all happening. The Frontier Wars were happening, probably in a very renegade newspaper. Couldn't find information on the paper, but the artist was an illustrator. And then over the top of it, I've done this sort of Rorschach of skulls to talk about the death, and I've called it Murder We Unwrote. Sort of, I suppose the more that I read about history, I realise that we were found on genocide and murder and frontier wars, and I think that's something that we don't have any, like even going around, there's no acknowledgement of that down even in Pinjarra. So I wanted to make a work about the fact that this continent's been founded on murder, and so that's what the work's about. Yeah, it's not specifically about any massacre site because I don't believe that I should have the right to sort of talk for that. So I haven't made a work about Pinjarra unless I was to consult or work with someone who is a descendant from that.
Mm. And I think, talking with you about this piece in the past, and you mentioned, interrogating that history and, realising how, as a society that we've benefited from this, and, you unpacking that history as on a personal level, and, the title Murder We Unwrote, commenting on how we've unwritten that history. And I thought it was quite brilliant when it comes to the concept side of it and everything. And like I said, the image itself sits right in the middle of that shared history in that muddied area. But I don't think it's gone way too far. I think it's something that is done well, and it's from your perspective and unpacking it as a white male in Australia. Really, have you got any comments, Ron?
No, I mean that's why I got behind a particular artist working at Wajama and other conversations like this. I mean, all of you put your feet on this country, right? Some of you have had children on this country. If you're not telling the truth about the nature of the history of this country that we're standing upon, okay, or making yourself aware of it, because you can, the information's there, then you're living above and away from it. And that makes it really hard to call it your home. How do you have conversations about your home? Well, you might start by asking some questions, and it's okay to ask questions and investigate and look at things. That's not really a problem. It's okay to talk about or think about to yourself, if this was my family, if this was my place, how would I feel if this happened to my ancestors, my people? And in fact, if you go back far enough in your own family lines, I'd be surprised if we didn't see similar stories come out, in your own cultural backgrounds and bits and pieces. How do you compare that then to what it is that you have here, standing here in this contemporary Australian society, the lucky country, now? So there are ways that you can explore and tip into these conversations, especially if you're somebody who's come from another place and your family story is one that actually can look at this and go, I actually remember what that was like. Back where I come from in my country, or within our cultural stories, this happened to our old people too. So how do you bring those two things together? How do you have a conversation about that, as a creative? I think that's perfectly okay.
And I think too, if you want to work in this space, it's definitely something you need to do is build that relationship with the local mob, and in particular the ones within the arts. And when we talk about cultural permissions in the past and earlier, people are getting permissions from people who have no understanding of the arts at all, or how the art industry works, and they're making decisions that affect the next generations coming through. So if you're going to be in that world, in that area, you need to make sure that you build a good relationship with the right people in the industry. And I think that's one of the most important things to actually look at. And Matt, I remember you making a comment on, within the Noongar mob, there's so many different elders in so many different areas. You want to talk about your struggles with that side of things?
I'm not going to go into the struggles of that. It's too complex, and it's you learn. It's still always a learning process on who to. I get better when I go to certain areas now. I try and consult mob that have a genuine footing in that community, rather than just going to that elder that is on every panel or does every welcome to country. You actually find someone who's rooted in that community to talk to. I just wanted to go back to this point. I think talking about shared history, I think it's really important for white arts to talk about the history that we've inherited, or how we've been privileged. And I think this work sort of speaks about that. Like, my privilege has been at the demise of the first peoples that were here, and general kind of talking about frontier wars, whereas the Wajimut one was a history telling work, and it probably goes too far. I think there's things about the work that sit all right with me, but when I look at it as an overall piece in hindsight from 5 years ago, it's not talking about that position of privilege or what I've inherited. So I don't know if I'd make a work like that again. But I think that shared space, it's really important for us to take ownership of truth and what we've inherited. And so that's why I've come here, and I'm encouraging people to work in this space, but work from that place. Yeah.
Don't be scared about being told off. One of the best telling offs I've ever got quietly was from your pop. Because I overstep marks all the time. Yeah? This is how we learn. You sit there and you step on it, and you go, oh, that's it, right, I shouldn't have stepped there, I need to step back, reconsider, and pull my big boy pants up and get on with it again. If you don't have conversations that allow for that to go back and forth, then we don't learn. And the people who actually have the rights to say that and have those conversations with you and correct you on how it is that they want to spell Noongar are Noongar people.
We'll go to questions in a minute. Well, just before we go to questions, I just wanted to, last couple of statements around, building relationships, cultural permissions, particularly, with the authority from our elders not being able to give that authority to non-Aboriginal people. And the ramifications of that is, what's happened in the past. Non-Aboriginal people have just gone and asked as many elders as they can until they get one yes. And once they get that one yes, the elders don't actually know the full extent of what they're going to do with that. And then that creates divide in our families, in our communities, and no artist has the right to do that to Aboriginal communities. So that's where, with cultural permissions, that's where it's really strong, that we need to understand that we don't fully have that authority, and if you want to work that like that, it has to be a collaborative approach with a Noongar artist and the appropriate Noongar artist on that topic as well.
And it's as simple as this. I mean, within our own families, right? What one family member has the right to actually have permission to one thing over the other. So even myself, if I was to sit there and say and claim something as a cultural, expert, by crikey, I'd have people come down from Broome and tell me off. It's not something that would happen in my family either. So going back to those basics again is really important.
Yeah, and as that Wajimut piece is getting remounted in an exhibition down in Bunbury, which I encourage everyone to come to. It's called Australianiality. One of the things that the curator is doing is actually working with the people mob from Bunbury. So as this body of work or exhibition goes to different communities, the curator's working with Aboriginal people from those communities to put work in, which I think is pretty important. Just that thing again, when you're speaking with elders, just be aware that, of who they are, just not just an elder that you can just pinch and take something from, like know their standing in that community and their relationships, and then work out if it's the best. You don't ask a plumber to do carpentry in your house. You wouldn't do that. So I mean, that's maybe a bad analogy, but ask the right person and do your background checks.
Well, I think we might go to questions. I see Amber about to explode. We got the mics for question time.
Be gentle.
I will be. I'll be respectful. Thank you all for your time today. It's a pretty, huge topic, and I know with lots of Noongar mates, it's really frustrating and really hurtful. Because the Australianity is a topic of today, it is being showed at Bunbury Regional Art Gallery, and there has been consultation with the Wadandi Noongar community there, but it hasn't been on their time. There hasn't been paid consultation, which I think is important, but that's a question to the panel about cultural permissions and making sure there's financial remuneration if you're, because it's education and people should be remunerated for that, but that's a question to the panel. But also there is so much outrage from this Australia exhibition, so I can't say that word either, coming to the Bunbury Regional Art Gallery because there isn't any Wadandi Noongar voices in what it means to be Australian in that exhibition, even though it was proposed a year ago. And I know Bragg has a lot to talk about that too, and there's another show at Bragg I'd love to talk about, but I'm going to be respectful of everybody's time. There's a horrible work at Bragg at the moment that, Amanda, I won't talk about that. But I just think it'd be good to hear from the panel about cultural permissions and financial remuneration, and making sure that if you're going to consult, making sure you listen to those voices and not just keep going through. But I just wanted to hear maybe your thoughts, Matt, and your thoughts, Ron.
It's news to me, so yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk to the...
Thank you.
Order? I mean, for a very long time, we've sought other people's and artists, creatives. You all know what it's like to be asked to do something for free, where someone actually sits there and plugs into you and says, oh, look, if you could just make this work, just so that we could actually show off this, or actually it's a promo opportunity for you. If you do this, we'll take photos and we'll tell everybody about how good an artist you are. Cultural knowledge, placement and place is something that is priceless. If you are seeking cultural support or authority of somebody to come and actually help a conversation to happen, then expect that that is something that you will pay for. This isn't something that you get given for free. There's been enough taking in this country of culture. enough taking of culture, and enough people claiming it, making their own business for free. Our challenge is now, and actually probably again leading, local government is actually those that you see leading the way on this. Local government are actually doing this far better than the state government is, and far better than the federal government is. Too many times Aboriginal people are expected to volunteer to lend their voice to guide a paper that gets put on a shelf and left there for the next 10 years or the next change of government. So we have a federal government that can't take that seriously. I mean, do we want to talk about any other topics that they... No, this probably is the wrong time. Wrong forum. But yes, if you seek to be guided by something, by somebody who has the appropriate knowledge and cultural basis in it, then yes, expect to be paying that person for that, even if it's as simple as a welcome to country. Actually, up in Karratha, during a Cossack Art Award probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I had one of the local government bodies at the time who was working for a mining company was quite upset that what they had to do was pay one of the local Nalawa people $500 for a welcome to country for what it was they had to do. Now, the Cossack Art Award had almost 15 different sponsors from 15 different mining companies and companies working in and around the place, okay? $500? That's like I put a 5-cent coin on the table whilst there's a whole pile of gold bullion on it. It's nothing. In the very least, you should expect that there be some sort of monetary exchange that says, we acknowledge who you are and we'd like you to come back and do it again, and we'll do it appropriately, professionally and respectfully, because you certainly would charge anyone else for that.
I think particularly when you get a group of elders together, they always should be paid for their time. That's not a question really. But there are some issues when it comes to money, and we need to look at what elders are being chosen. Are they chosen because they're an elder in the community and their expertise in that field? And if there aren't any elders with the expertise, you need to bring someone in, might not be from the area, but another Aboriginal person who has that expertise so they can guide the decisions of the elders, so they have an informed decision around what they're doing rather than just, pleasing the people who paid them. Because that's happened in the past too, where, some elders might just rock up for the money. And, that's a problem. That's where we need to get the right elders with the right expertise and pay them appropriately.
Well, and also process too, I'm imagining, and that's another part of the question, isn't it? It's not just necessarily creating a conversation the way that perhaps maybe you might table a conversation when conducting business, say, at a local government level, or driving a project. If you're seeking guidance from appropriate cultural leaders in that community, then they need to go through a cultural process of having that conversation that's appropriate to them, and you need to have a timeline that allows for that conversation to actually occur. So things come back. If it takes 12 months to have a conversation about something and you haven't factored that in, about something that's really important to that group of people, that's not their fault. That's actually yours. All right? You need to allow people to have good conversations about what it is that actually is their business. And that needs to occur on their time, through their processes, as opposed to a project that's running, behind time and quick, we need this decision right now. No, that's not being respectful, and that's not making, allowance for people to have proper conversations about things.
I've worked a lot with Aboriginal companies so that they've done all the sort of letters of, but even Aboriginal companies have had a lot of trouble with the way that the funding's set up, getting letters of permission. It's an ongoing issue actually. There was a project that was going to happen in Derby, and I had text messages from some of the mobs saying that they were going to be in town. I said, can you send that in an email signed? Didn't hear anything back. I went up there without funding. The project happened because everyone was on board, but getting those permissions weren't going to work. And so it is a very hard area because different organisations have different protocols around getting permissions. People have sorry business. People got their own lives, and with the Bunbury project, it's sort of news to me, but I was told that a couple of Wandandi artists have been consulted, like Sandra Hill and so forth. But maybe we can have a chat about that after, because I'm not up to date with where Australianiality is in terms of its Bunbury leg. But the idea behind that exhibition is to go to Bunbury and actually have an exhibition with Bunbury artists, so it'd be a shame if that's not starting to get in, talks are in place.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay, hello. Yes, so my name is Ida. You're talking, sorry, I didn't get your name, but I'm interested, yes. Rob? Yeah, but also I'm interested in with other panels as well. You're talking about how to introduce Aboriginal culture and also language and other things to, my girls were born in Sydney, right? So they are a second generation, first generation or second generation? So I'm from Indonesia. So when I think for you to introduce the Aboriginal things is, I think the best place is in school. I've been living in Australia for 24 years in 3 states and still confused about Aboriginal thing. The only thing we learned when I had the opportunity to teach about history when I was in Canberra, and what we teach the students is about Ned Kelly. That's all. So my girls now, I think they also lost, they missed the opportunity to know more about Aboriginal culture and language in schools. Because after Ned Kelly, that's it. Nothing, no more in the curriculum, no more about Aboriginal, and also because you are in so many languages and also so many cultures. But the school is on states, right? So I'm just thinking, maybe like we are now in Western Australia, maybe the elders, or like you also arts and also other Department of Education, sit down together and then make one language and then put in the curriculum. Because like I'm Indonesian teacher, but I miss the language now because I'm a math teacher now. So, and also in school, also there is like the compulsory to teach students language other than English. And why don't we also, these language teachers also learn about culture, Aboriginal culture, and also maybe language that national for Western Australia. Not many, because going to be confused, but which one is just the biggest Aboriginal culture, and then make it in the curriculum. So as I said, my daughters now, my children now, they are in university, but they don't really learn about cultures when they were in high school. So that's what's my idea. My suggestion is maybe you can talk in the Department Western Australia, what language we have to put in the curriculum, because I live here now 9 years in Western Australia. When I went to Indonesia, I lived there for 2.5 years. When I came back, I found that more young family from different countries, especially from Indonesia. So how do myself, how do I introduce Aboriginal when I don't really know about this?
You okay for me to work with that? I've worked in the education department. In fact, I worked as manager of Aboriginal education for a district that challenged principals to try and be more responsive in the curriculum in and around Aboriginal education in general. That was over 20 years ago. And in fact, what the West Australian what the West Australian Education Department did was decrease its Aboriginal education teams and shut them down altogether. This isn't it's not a new thing by any means. It's incorrect to think and to suggest that there is one Aboriginal language that we would teach all Australians. If you consider Europe as it's presented today, with all of the different countries across Europe.
No, sorry. I mean, in Western Australia, what is the biggest language?
Same again, and let me continue with my point. if you consider Europe, and then you have France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, and all the different nations, that is Western Australia, just from an Aboriginal language point of view. All of the different Aboriginal language groups are actually different Aboriginal nations and cultural groups. The biggest group, in fact probably the biggest group across all of Australia, is actually the Noongar Nations. And that's of course where we are now. But we wouldn't take the Noongar language necessarily and say that it's a language that represents Western Australian Aboriginal peoples. Because that'd be like trying to say that the language spoken in Indonesia on a particular island represents all of the other islands across Indonesia. It wouldn't work that way. It's a complex thing, and one of the biggest problems is our nation, Australia, has continued to talk about us as Aboriginal peoples or Indigenous peoples rather than acknowledge us as separate nations in our own countries. Slowly that's happening, and certainly, like I said before, local governments are probably working out how to do that best and better. And from that point of view, local people are starting to introduce in schools around the place now. You'll see actually schools in Perth develop and use language of this place in the languages other than English classrooms. They're slowly teaching those things, some schools more than others. But unfortunately, our Australian society doesn't value its Aboriginal cultures and nations at a federal level and even at a state level. Because if they did, we'd actually already know a lot of this stuff already by now, and everybody who lives here would have their feet down and would be actually talking languages that belong to them and the nations that they're in, because we'd be sharing this place more appropriately from an Aboriginal perspective, as opposed to one that actually built a society over the top of it that dismisses us as a people, full stop. And one of the other big struggles still is that the Aboriginal and Islander peoples across this nation still only represent 3% of this country's population. Out of 23 million people, only 3% of us are those who are of this place and have connections to it, historically and traditionally. The rest have arrived here and built a whole other society over the top of it that speaks to a whole other, or dances to a whole other cultural tune, if you like, for one of a way to put it. And one of the ways that we're trying to actually get that back is to do things like, if you have these conversations, learn about where your feet are. Learn about where you sit and call your home and how you grow up in this place. What's the language I should be talking to, or who are the people I should be talking to here? Is there language appropriate for me to use here in this particular place? It's still a challenge though, but I take your point.
We've got one online question.
So this person asks, for anyone seeking a collaboration or cultural permissions in communities where they don't know the local mob, or there may not be a known established cultural group, how can they best find the right people to seek the appropriate guidance? What would be the first steps? How can we respectfully ensure we avoid creating arguments between family groups, as you mentioned?
Well, why do they want to collaborate with that specific group? Or do they have a connection? And if they have a connection, how can they have a connection without knowing the community? That's something that I would say straight off the bat there. But yeah, I get what you mean. There's a lot of work that you have to search and ask the different cultural groups, who are these people, where can I find them, and that's part of the work they have to do. And it might take a lot of time, but it's necessity. It's necessary. Like, you have to do it.
Well, it might be that for this person, the question actually is if you're already having that conversation, you're asking those questions inside your head already, is it in fact a collaboration? Because if you're not aware of who it is around and about in your community that you could have these conversations with, you're sort of in a fraught position to start with in the first place. You could almost sit there and say, if I really can't have a good conversation with this about somebody, maybe this isn't something I should be having a conversation about in the first place. And maybe I need to go back and think about it some more.
Yep, another question at the top.
So on social media, I guess in the context of cultural appropriation with art, but also broadly, there can be a lot of polarizing comment sections where you see people saying like this is cultural appropriation, or people saying like I'm from this minority group and I think it's okay, because I think there can be an element of subjectivity to it. So my question is, what are your thoughts on navigating that as an artist, but also as a member from a minority group where you have polarizing views?
You more talking about, like, say, people of colour having conversations and developing work from an international as well as perhaps a local point of view, drawing back on their own business and addressing some of the things that pop up and around themselves?
Yeah, I guess from personal experience, there's been certain, so I'm Indian, and certain things that I think are cultural appropriation, somebody else from the same culture might think, oh, this is appreciation. And yeah, situations on social media with maybe art or someone I think maybe appropriating culture versus somebody else saying this is fine. Yeah, how do you navigate that as a minority, but also maybe as an artist who is having to deal with both of those perspectives?
Yeah, comment sections are fun, aren't they? I think literally just the definitions don't lie, and they're pretty clear. And I think, you know, if someone says something is appropriate and you think it isn't, then that's a discussion for you two as well. And, you know, again, they might just be a troll. Who knows? But yeah, it can be a good space, but it could also be a really, really bad space to be in, particularly in comment sections.
Well, it's also one guided by your cultural, your cultural elders. So if you've got the support of your parents, your old people, and those actually who would sit around you and say, well, no, actually, you have a right to say this because these are your cultural conversations and this is relative to you, guided by your old people and your ancestors and your story, then that's that validity as well. I think it's also entirely appropriate, as I would, if I was going back and someone was challenging me about that, and it's happened, I've gone back to my mother and my grandmother and grandfather and said, this person's trying to say this about this business, what do you think about that? And I found them pretty straightforward about their answers. And I think that's really important too. This is for all of you. If you can, don't forget your own stories, your own old people and your own cultural roots, because they are as valid here, okay, bringing it and putting it down on this country, as what you bed yourself in. If someone's challenging you about who you are culturally, or perhaps shaking that tree around you, making you uncomfortable, go back to your cultural roots, or your cultural guidance, if you like, your brain's trust, and have that conversation in a place that actually I think is more appropriate, because that can guide you a lot better than perhaps some of the stuff generically outside of it.
I think that's time. We'll hand over to Beck.
Thank you, all three of you. You've been wonderful, and I'm sure you'll agree there's been some really invaluable and open discussion and information delivered today. So before we go on, please give our presenters a round of applause. And I'd also really like to thank you all very, very much for actually being interested in seeking out this information. And really, we've only just started to scratch the surface. There's a long journey to go on this topic, and as has been reiterated a number of times by the presenters, the best way is to really be humble, seek information, be open about it, really truly seek to collaborate, and not in any sort of bureaucratic government way, but in an authentic way, so we can really be open to understanding the intricacies and complexities and beauty and strength of our Aboriginal culture here in our local area. So once again, another round of applause. I think they deserve it. Thanks.